Welcome to Sketchbook Legends. I'm your artist, Paul Hosteller. Today we're drawing Robert E. Howard's creation, the most famous barbarian in the world, Conan of Cimmerian. Quick back history to the character. Conan was invented in 1932 by Robert E. Howard, a pulp writer for Weird Tales magazine and a few others. He was just 26 at the time and already had an impressive CV of weird pulp stories under his belt. He came up with Conan as sort of an idea to explore a character who went from civilization to civilization. He wanted to use real historical civilizations and cultures and nations, but being located in rural Texas at the time, he didn't have very much access to libraries or research materials, so he just made them up instead. You'll see here, most notably, that I've decided to draw horizontally for Conan, put him in a horizontal landscape style composition. Half because Conan being a larger-than-life character, I thought it would be better to have him fill the entire frame, and half because being a very active character, the propulsion of him moving in a certain direction I felt deserved a landscape format in order to give you a sense of space. You'll also notice right from the sketch that I've made Conan impossibly sort of cartoonishly muscular. Conan was portrayed by Arnold Schwarzenegger, famed bodybuilder, back in the 80s in the Conan the Barbarian movie. Even Schwarzenegger didn't have a waist quite that skinny, though. But one of Conan's defining features is that he's huge and muscular. It's mentioned in pretty much every story. It's almost his defining feature, other than his black hair and his sullen brow, as Howard calls it. It's integral to the character that he be huge and strong and also surprisingly fast. And if you've only seen the Conan movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger, you wouldn't know it, but the stories have Conan as also quick-witted and quite a talker and charmer, like a classic pulp hero. You know, he can sort of do it all, and he does so in a bombastic and violent way. Now, Robert E. Howard went on to write 21 stories about Conan, 3 of which were published after his death in 1936 with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. And he left a further 4 unfinished stories, a poem, an essay, and a sort of spin-off story that have been unearthed by his heirs after the fact and subsequently published. And technically, the original versions of the Conan stories as published in Weird Tales have lapsed into the public domain, at least in America. But a number of other writers have since taken it upon themselves to continue the legends of Conan by writing and publishing entirely new material about his adventures. These include fantasy heavyweights like Robert Jordan and Poole Anderson, Another one, L. Sprague de Camp, notoriously inserted his own writing into many of Howard's previously published stories and republished them as paperback collections in the 50s. Now, this wouldn't be that noteworthy except for the fact that de Camp got up-and-coming illustrator and cartoonist Frank Frazetta to paint the covers. These really popped on the shelves. Frazetta had a keen, artistic vision in depicting oily, muscular men and the monsters and women that surround them. And his version really became the template for every single other artist who would draw Conan from then on. Present company not excluded. Other notable artists to depict Conan include Earl Norham, Boris Vallejo, comic book artist Neil Adams, and John Howe, who's more famous for his Tolkien illustrations. He did a lot of work on the Lord of the Rings movies. The Conan books that I own are illustrated by Mark Schultz and Gregory Manchess. And the first artist to depict Conan visually, it should be noted, was a woman illustrator, Margaret Brundage, whose covers to Weird Tales tended to feature scantily clad princesses that Conan often fought for over the barbarian himself. And of course, I mentioned that Conan has been depicted in hundreds of movies and comic books and cartoons and TV shows. Arnold Schwarzenegger, I've mentioned, played him in a series of middling sword and sandals flicks that flattened both Conan's history and his personality to better suit the acting level of Schwarzenegger at a time, which was not high. I think in the 2000s there was an attempt at a Conan reboot starring Jason Momoa, who all went on to play Aquaman and a bunch of other people in high concept movies. One fun thing about the Conan stories is how they encompass almost the entire life of the character from callow youth to old age, but are not written in order. The first story published, the Phoenix on the Sword, involves an elderly Conan, tiring in his role as a benevolent king, surviving an assassination attempt that's committed by a mutant gorilla. But later stories portray Conan as a teenager fighting frost giants in his homeland of Cimmeria, and later on as a thief, a pirate, a mercenary, a treasure hunter, a bandit chief, and a general. But no two stories were written or published in order, which lends itself to the sort of legend of Conan and the idea that all these stories have been told over and over by the people who encountered them, and you hear them in the same order that you might just wandering from place to place. You can't see it yet, but I've decided to take my version of Conan from the Howard story Beyond the Black River, in which Conan spends most of his time scouting evil wizards and fighting even more barbaric barbarians in a massive swamp on the edges of civilization. I have him holding a giant axe. I'm not sure if he has an axe in the story, but an axe is one of his signature weapons. And Later on, I'll draw the ground covered in muck and throw some Spanish moss and cypress trees in the background, just to give the proper atmosphere. Now, Conan's stories take place in the Hyborian Age, which, according to Robert E. Howard, was a real epoch in human history, set roughly after Atlantis sank, but before any other currently known civilization. Like I mentioned, he wanted to set his stories in real history, with his barbarian wandering from culture to culture, but he didn't have the resources to do so, and the pulp magazines at the time demanded a furious rate of writing in order to make a living. So fantasy was simply the more economical option for him. But the idea that the Hyborian Age was a real historical age is also pretty fun, because it means that Howard got to draw his fantasy maps on top of actual geography. So you can see Conan's adventures happening in sub-Saharan Africa or the Himalayas. As a native of Cimmeria, he's apparently from either Northern Ireland or Western Scandinavia. Due to the, oceans rising and falling, he imagines certain land masses growing and sinking. So the maps don't match completely, but you can definitely see, that's supposed to be Scotland. The country of Aquilonia is located in France or Germany. Each culture sort of manages to survive through to the present day, and to what poor Texan in early 20th century America might imagine the Stone Age version of, say, Egypt or Spain to be. The swamps I've placed Conan in are supposed to exist west of France, which, if you might know, is just the English Channel. At some point, I suppose they sank into the ocean like Atlantis. While I'm drawing Conan's knuckles here, I'm already thinking about how I'm going to design the sword that he's holding. I've already penciled in a sort of decorative pommel, an animal head. I don't know yet whether it'll be a cat or a bird or something, but I wanted something that stood in direct contrast to the axe in his other hand, which was crude and angular and made by a culture that doesn't exist anymore, and I wanted the sword to clearly reflect, I don't know, you can see it's got a curved blade. It's almost a scimitar, and he probably picked that up in one of his journeys to one of the fictional nations that became the Middle East, or Lower India, or Asia. It sort of mirrors his journey as a barbarian from a crude bruiser fighting just with whatever he has at hand, and to eventually becomes a leader of nations, and does both equally well, as pulp heroes inevitably do. It's become a de rigueur to portray Conan without a shirt. In the stories, it's rarely mentioned how clothed he is. The shirtlessness mostly came from, I feel, Frank Frazetta and the artists wanting to show off how well they knew anatomy. I've got him here, drawn without a shirt, but in a way that suggests that he was wearing a shirt, but the harsh terrain has simply ripped his clothes to tatters over time. He used to have pants here, and now they've become shorts. No loincloth for my barbarian, though. Another thing that Frazetta designed for Conan that has sort of just stuck was his fringe. You can see he's got bangs right there. I believe Frazetta was the first one to draw Conan with a neat set of bangs. Previously, he had his hair swooped back, as was the style in the 1920s. But the bangs look sort of stuck. They got rid of it for the movie because, I don't know, Arnold Schwarzenegger's wig, I guess, didn't lend itself to bangs. Jason Momoa as Conan didn't have bangs either. But those were not the styles at the time. And so the art directors on those movies just sort of went more with what they thought audiences would accept rather than what they thought would make them look possibly too feminine. Here we go. Half out of not wanting to draw a whole lot of feet, and half in homage to the Black River story. I've coated Conan's feet with muck. It was a quick way to make him seem larger than he really is on the page, just because I could bury parts of his body inside the ground below foot level, and avoid having to draw the interaction of solid feet with solid ground. Also, having a character be incredibly filthy does a lot of heavy lifting when it comes to rendering, because you can get away with a lot of speckling and shading, and just create the illusion that this character is covered with a monotone muck, rather than having to texture and detail everything differently to bring out the details. A lot of artists draw Conan smooth-chested, like a wrestler. That's how Schwarzenegger and Momoa both portrayed him. I decided to make him a little bit hairy in the chest and on the legs and arms. I threw a bunch of hair on there, partially just to make him more savage looking and partially just to buck the prevailing trend. I feel like a barbarian probably wouldn't be shaving his pits at every opportunity. So rather than looking oiled and muscular. My Conan is sort of filthy and earthy. He's got scabs on his fingers and cracks and scars on his knees. A lot of these fantasy heroes, I feel, they don't really show as much damage as they would be taking in real life. And I think that given the high activity of their lifestyle, that's a real, disappointment. I don't know if disappointment's the real word. It's a missing point. I like it when a character that's been active for the entire story gets more disheveled and dirty and bedraggled and tired as the movie goes on. I think that's one of the reasons why Die Hard is such a classic, is that you see John McClane looking really neat and nice at the beginning of the movie, cleaned up, ready to impress his wife, and at the end, he's an absolute mess of a human being, barely able to stand. It adds to the character rather than taking away. I get that a lot of the times actors want to look their best, and I get that a lot of artists want to show off particular skills, but I think it does a disservice. That's the word, disservice. It does a disservice to the character not to show the toll that their adventure takes on their body. One of the other things you gotta consider is that when you put a character in an environment, you really ought to have him interacting with that environment, and that includes considering lighting, which is one of those things that I feel I'm not the greatest at. But I'm doing my best with only two tones, black and white, taking a lot of my cues from Bill Watterson of Calvin and Hobbes fame. Did a black and white comic strip with no gray shades for over a decade, and did a marvelous job portraying a lot of woods, a lot of environments, and well-rendered characters, just using black and white. So I'm pulling what I know of Calvin and Hobbes, what I can remember, and trying to populate this swamp while also trying to not run out of ink on camera. I'm using my brush pen. Watterson was probably using an actual brush in ink. Less of concern, but again, I never draw these things at my drafting table. There's not enough room to film them. These happen at my kitchen table, so I have to drag everything back and forth, and the brush pens just make more sense. Here I'm doing some swamp work. Again, I chose Black River because swamps can either be very easy to draw or very hard to draw, depending on how much detail you want to throw in. There is a lot of life going on in swamps, but I've chosen to sort of combine all of that life and detail into a morass of mud and twigs and stumps, just to evoke a swamp. Since this is a swamp that, as I mentioned, is currently submerged in the English Channel. Who knows what it really looked like in the Hyborian Age. And in order to give a sense of motion to the scene, I've made sure to make all the little stumps and bits of flotsam stuck in that swamp to lean in the same direction as he's running. It just helps create a visual flow. Adding a little extra texture to highlight the environment never hurts. And that's Conan the Barbarian. Alright, if you liked this video, you can click the like button. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, you can click the subscribe button. That'll get you notifications or updates about whenever I drop another video, which happens every week, every Wednesday, until I lose interest or forget. You can find me elsewhere on the internet. I've got a Blue Sky account at phostetlerart. I'm on Patreon if you'd like to drop me some money in exchange for me bestowing you with wonderful artworks. I also have a Ko-Fi if you'd like to give me money regardless of anything that I bestow upon anybody at all. And you can find those at phostetlerart also. All right, stay sketching, stay legendary. See you next time.